Right. Welcome, as I said, to this session for the Centre for Postgraduate Studies on Qualitative Data Analysis. I feel like I should start with a bit of a disclaimer, which is that it is almost impossible to talk about all of the complexity and all of the ins and outs and any specificities around qualitative data analysis in a 1.5 hour seminar. So Sue McKenna and I are in the process of planning the second semester for the CPGS in terms of short courses and seminars. And if there is an element of either collecting qualitative data or analyzing qualitative data that we've been unable to really go into enough depth on for you or for a group of scholars that you're connected with, please won't you pop me an email? I'm going to put my email into the chat right now and say, you know, Sharon, you mentioned creative methodologies in the session on collecting qualitative data. Could we please have a seminar on dedicated to creative methodologies? Or could we please have a seminar dedicated to different ways of approaching coding? Or whatever the case is. And then if that is within the realm of possibility for us to organize a seminar on, we will do our best to do that and to find speakers who can come and share their wisdom with us. So please do share with us your ideas. We cannot promise that we can accommodate all of them. Some of them just might not be suitable for a seminar format, but we'll do our best. Okay, so having said that, we're going to talk today about analyzing qualitative data with the disclaimer that what I'm really trying to do here is not give you a how-to guide to analyzing your data. It's going to be much more some slightly more general principles around what analysis is in a research process, what we're trying to do in an analysis process, and where we want to try and end up. And there are some examples, and there's an activity for us to do together later on. So before we start, I'd like to hear a little bit from you so that I have a sense of who's in the room and what are you collecting? What forms of data are you collecting and analyzing that for you represent qualitative data? So if you can take a minute and just type in the chat the kinds of data that you're collecting. And then I've got another question I'd like you to type a little bit on, and then we'll get started with some of my thoughts. Interviews, focus groups, documents, historical narrative, okay. Right, phenomenological interviews. So lots and lots of you are doing sort of interviews, focus groups, observations using artifacts. Okay, keep going. This is all very interesting. Interviews and observation, WhatsApp videos. Okay, all right. Performances, videos, recordings, student essays, journal entries. Okay, so you've got a variety of quite rich data that you're collecting here. Memories, that's really interesting. Okay, so we've got key informant interviews, secondary data, focus groups. Okay, so pretty much some quite creative data, and then also some I don't want to say ordinary data, but some data sources that we consider to be quite standard in qualitative research, right? Like focus groups, interviews, observations, WhatsApp transcripts. Okay, cool. Right, so now I'd like you to think a little bit about how you are beginning to approach analyzing your data. And if you don't know that yet, then maybe you could reflect a little bit for like 2 minutes on what does analysis mean to you? What do you think it is that you're trying to do with all of this data? So I'm going to give you like 2 minutes to do a little bit of a free write and let me know what you think about these 2 questions. And then we'll dive into some discussion. collating and making sense of the data, developing themes in response to my critical research questions. No problem, Alexia. Translation devices and codes. Analysis just scares me. Should I be writing verbatim? Okay, we can deal with that hopefully a little bit. Using software to organize and code data, and then using LCT, which is a theoretical framework to code data. Transformation of data into frequencies, tables, and graphs. That's a very particular form of analysis, yes. More of maybe a different kind of qualitative analysis, potentially. Discourse analysis. Okay, so actually, Ida, we're going to be looking a little bit at critical discourse analysis as one example later. Conceptual framework to gather, analyze, and synthesize data, practice architecture's theory. So theory, coding into sayings, doings, and relatings. It seems so subjective. Yes, that's something that we should probably talk about. Transcribing. So transcribing is one of the steps in the analysis process. Yes. Okay, so keep it coming, and I'm going to move on. Right. Oh, Tabang says not sure where to begin. Well, hopefully, Tabang, we can give you some ideas today about where to begin. Okay, so I'm going to move the chat screen down. And then if you guys are putting questions in the chat, please keep them coming. I might not talk to them right now this minute, but I will come back to them. Okay, so analysis can be seen as a process, and that word is very key, a process of mediating between more generalized understandings of your phenomenon and the specific data that you have generated, collected, or created in the process of actually undertaking your research, physically going out into whatever counts as the field and collecting data, generating data, creating data, okay? So theory is a useful tool in creating what Carl Mason has called a mediating language, which explains to readers, and you must all think, of course, of your examiners when you are particularly working on a thesis. I know some of you are not here because you're working on a thesis, you're working on other kinds of research projects. So then you've got to think, who am I writing this for? If you're writing it primarily for examiners, you're writing it primarily for readers, to some extent, the same considerations apply, which is that you have to make very, very clear how you got to the conclusions that you're going to draw from this study. We do research to find out something that we don't know about or don't know enough about, right? And what we end up doing in the process of writing about that research is making claims to knowledge. And when we make claims to knowledge based on data that we have generated, which is the basis for our new or original contribution to knowledge, we have to be very sure that we're making credible and trustworthy claims to knowledge. But what we often find, and in some fields, my field, for example, education is often accused of this, if we're vague about our methodology, if we're vague about the basis on which we've collected the data, if we're vague about the basis on which we have organized, coded, and made sense of the data, analyzed the data, then it's quite difficult for the reader to actually fully believe and trust our claims to knowledge. Because what you're essentially tacitly saying to the reader is, look, I have this data and you just got to believe me, right? What I'm saying is true. And the reader's going to kind of say, especially if it's an examiner, is going to very skeptically say, well, how do I know that? So in our methodology sections, right, we all talk about credibility, we all talk about reliability, we all talk about validity in some or other way. Some of us may further talk about triangulation and other kinds of things. And part of that is it's a dimension of doing ethical research and doing research that makes contributions to knowledge. We talk about, for example, reliability being the extent to which our study can be replicated by other researchers. We talk about credibility as the extent to which our findings represent valid, true, or justifiable claims to knowledge, right? We talk about validity in terms of the data that I've collected is a valid representation of the phenomenon that I'm studying. So this now comes to analysis. So if you've talked about all of that in your methodology, and if that kind of, if those concepts have influenced how you've generated, collected, collated your data, then they have to carry all the way through into the analysis process. So if you are not clear about how you got from raw data to findings, then it's going to be difficult, A, for anybody else to read your study and try and replicate it in a different context or with a different population of participants. And it's going to be difficult for them potentially to trust your claims to knowledge. Yeah. So that's why we need to mediate between theory and data. That's the argument I'm making. So there's a little bit of a video where we just talk a little bit about what theory is, and it's quite a useful way of thinking about theory. So I'm going to hope that it plays, and you'll just have to let me know, please, that you can hear the sound correctly. Oops, that went too fast. Okay. Oh, why is this not playing now? Okay, it doesn't seem to be playing. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to share the link with you all so that you can actually hear it. It did work when I tested it earlier, but typically, because I'm in front of all of you, it's now not going to work. Essentially, in this video, the speaker argues that theory is literally like a pair of glasses. So any of you who wear glasses will know, I'm certainly one of them, that when you put your glasses on, especially if your eyesight is particularly bad, things become clearer, okay? You may have the experience, for example, of looking across at some trees that are far away and just seeing a blur, and you put your glasses on and suddenly you can see the leaves on the trees. Oh, maybe it is going to play. Here we go. Good. All right, let's see if this works. It's going to be slow, typically.
Hello, my name is Chrissy Bowie, and this is a short presentation exploring the construct of theory in postgraduate research. So the presentation is trying to answer the question, what is theory? All postgraduate research, regardless of its level, whether it's on master's or doctoral level research, and also regardless of the subject area, needs theory.
Sorry about this, guys. I am plugged into my modem, so I don't know why it's being so slow. But if you could just bear with me for a few minutes, it's only a 4-minute video, so hopefully this will catch up. All right. I don't actually think this is going to work so well. So let's just leave it for now because this is actually just going to take too long and we only have until 4:30. I'm going to send you all the link. I'll put it underneath this video on YouTube so that you can go and watch it for yourself. But as I was saying, she argues that all research needs theory. We need to be able to make sense of the world from a different perspective than our own common sense understandings of it. And we can talk a little bit about why that is, but generally speaking, our own common sense understandings of the world are, by their very nature, partial, right? So if you are trying to add to knowledge in your field, and you're really just coming at that with your own partial, biased, personal understandings of how the world works, then you're not going to make a contribution to knowledge, but you may well be challenged quite hard on the nature of that contribution. And it may well be a very partial and very biased contribution to knowledge. And the kind of point isn't just contributing to knowledge in the sense of going, look, I made a contribution, can I have an honors or a master's or a PhD now? Especially at PhD level, but not only at PhD level. It's about making a contribution to knowledge that pushes knowledge in your field forward in some or other way, or that challenges existing knowledge in your field in some or other way. So in order to do that, we can't really use our data to just say, hey, look at my data. This is what my data is. What we need to be able to do is say, this is what my data means. And in order to do that, we need some kind of way of moving above or out of our local data, our local knowledge of things, to go, how can this connect with the wider field that I'm interested in? How can I use my data to tell a story that other people in other contexts with problems or questions similar to mine can recognize and build on? How can I contribute to knowledge that's beyond just this one case that I'm interested in? And theory is one of the tools that helps us use this. But as Chrissy argues in this video, and I really am going to encourage you to watch it after this, is that if we have different sets of lenses, so if you imagine if you put different lenses on your glasses, right? And then you put your glasses on, you'd be able to see different things, right? I always imagine, if any of you have ever seen that slightly cheesy Nicolas Cage movie, National Treasure, where he finds a treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence, and he finds these magical glasses that have green lenses and blue lenses and purple lenses, and depending on which lenses he uses, he can see different parts of the map. And theory is a little bit like that. If I put, for example, legitimation code theory lenses on, and I look at a set of data, I'm going to see particular kinds of things. I'm also going to be influenced by the research questions that I'm asking, the questions I want that data to answer. But if I put, for example, a critical discourse pair of glasses on, and I looked at the same set of data, I'd be asking a different set of questions, and I'd find different things. So theory can help us see the world in different ways. Theory is not some static thing that you have in your project because you have to have theory. Theory is a tool that you use to make meaning of the world, to make meaning of your data, right? So what you need to understand then is what's going on in your field. And this is, of course, why we make you do so much reading, right? To join a field, we need to know, what are the current explanations for this phenomenon that I'm interested in? What other kinds of theories are researchers using in my field to answer the kinds of questions that I'm asking in my project? How do these theories impact on the methods that they use? And how have they affected the data that is collected and how the data is analyzed? And then understanding that this is where the field is right now, and this is what the field is talking about and interested in, what am I adding or contributing? Okay, so what's key here is I hear this from a lot of students. In this chapter, I'm presenting my data. Now, I think you need to eliminate that word presenting from your vocabularies right now as qualitative researchers. Because as qualitative researchers, we are not reporters. We're not saying, well, this person said this, and then this person said that, and this person said this, and then I observed this, and the document said that. That's a step in the process, but it's not what you present in the thesis. You don't actually present data. You make sense of data, and then you selectively use data to tell a story that leads you in the conclusions to your research project, to your thesis, to answering your research questions. So you're actually a little bit more of a storyteller than a reporter. You are layering meaning into the story, okay? You're not just saying, this is what happened, and then in essence saying to your reader or your examiner, what do you think? You have to tell us what to think. You have to tell us what you think your data means, in line with your research questions, in line with your theoretical and conceptual frameworks, and in line with your methodology, right? So all of these pieces have to connect together so that you don't have a thesis that's literally like a set of parts, but you have a thesis that creates an argument that is more than the sum of its different parts. So if we imagine that the top of this space, floating above any particular context or particular question or particular research problem, this is abstract land, right? And this is often where the most theoretical descriptions of the world tend to live. Because if you think about theory, you can take, for example, with a theory that Robin mentioned earlier, you can take, I'm sorry, Robin, I've completely forgotten what it's called, practice architectures theory. You can take legitimation code theory. You can take Anthony Giddens' theory of structuration. You can take the personality trait theory. You can take leadership theory. You can take any number of different kinds of theories of the way the world works in a range of different disciplines, and you can apply them to a lot of different kinds of problems, right? You can even borrow theories from other disciplines. For example, political science, which is a discipline that I have my first degrees in, borrows a lot of theoretical explanations about the world from philosophy, from ethics, from sociology, sometimes even from history, from economics, depending on the problem that people want to solve, right? So you don't have to use theories that are only in your field. You can borrow all sorts of theories and you adapt and apply them, which is why we say you build a theoretical framework. You don't just find it ready-made for your study, you build it. So you've built your theoretical framework, whatever counts as your theoretical framework. And now you have to use that theory to make sense of your data. So what you don't want is to have this lovely abstracted theoretical description in one chapter of your thesis, and then you get to your study, your data, and your methodology, and then you've come all the way down to like super focused local context. This study, this exact study with this exact data set that I got from these people in this part of Johannesburg on these dates, right? That's the opposite of abstracted. That's very contextual, very local, very specific. And so what we sometimes find, and I've certainly found this in theses that I've examined, is that there's a beautiful theoretical chapter where the theory is really well explained, and then I get to the data, and it's like the theory hasn't even happened. It's not even there. And what I get is I get the reporter saying, I'm going to describe my data for you. I'm going to just give you my data. I'm going to present my data to you. And what I actually want to see as an examiner is more this orange wave. I want to see you saying, theoretically, this is what we would have expected. But if you look at the data, this particular piece of data, we see that this isn't exactly what the theory is saying. So what does that mean? Well, it may mean that we have to adapt the theory or challenge the theory or build on the theory. So what you're doing is you're weaving theory and data, general and specific, together to create meanings that will help you answer your research questions. So I'm going to show you a few examples which I hope will help to make sense of this. But obviously we can pause after this for some questions, right? So if I was going to use Pierre Bourdieu's theory, and this will probably make sense to some extent to people working in sociology, politics, anthropology, perhaps education, fields where we are particularly interested in questions of why things work the way they work. So Pierre Bourdieu has some theory that can help us with that. So if we're talking, now remember we're color coding now. So if we're talking in terms of this yellow line and the orange line, right? We've got the theory. So theoretically, you would say, Bourdieu argues that access to a field is mediated through having particular forms of social symbolic capital. The values assigned to the forms of capital are set by those who are most powerful within the field. That's pretty abstract, right? We don't know what the field is. We don't know what social symbolic capital means. We've just got a theoretical description of these concepts and how they might connect together. So the first part of what we do, and usually we do this in the methodology chapter, is we mediate. So we say, I'm not just going to describe the theory. I'm going to begin very slowly to use the theory. So I'm going to say, in a study such as this one that I'm doing right now, so I'm starting to come down that wave a little bit towards my context. I'm not coming all the way down yet. I'm starting to bring it down. I'm saying the field would be higher education, represented by public universities in general. And those who are able to decide the value of the different forms of capital participants, in this case students, enter with, or those who administer, decide on, and control admissions processes. So we're not clear on exactly who that is yet. We have a general description. The social symbolic capitals this study is exploring include, and that implies that it might not necessarily be all of these, but these are the kinds of things you're going to begin to look for when you go out into the field, include proficiency in English, the schools one has attended and the marks obtained, volunteer work and other credentials, and where a student comes from, rural, urban, or international. Looking through this lens will enable this study to explore what is valued, how it is valued, and what effects this may have on the kinds of access one gets to the field itself and to participation in higher education. So mediating language is a little bit more general. It's not as abstract as theory, but it's also not saying the very specific capitals I found in my data were these. It's not saying that yet. It's saying this is how I'm going to try and use the theory. So this is how I'm going to try and adapt it and apply it to this kind of study. So mediating language is the first part of an analysis process that begins to say to your reader, this is how I'm going to use my theory. And that's quite an important step, right? Because theory is a tool. It's not a thing we have, it's a thing we use. Okay, so here's another example. In human resources and management context, there are different theories of leadership and characteristics of a good leader. And I'm putting that in quotation marks because obviously I'm showing that this is not an uncomplex or simple term, right? What counts as good is quite subjective. So there are different theories of what good is. Trait theory assumes that people have characteristics or qualities intrinsically that tend to make them great as leaders. These qualities may be assumed to be natural rather than learned. Trait theory focuses on examining great leaders to identify their traits they share. Allport identified cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits, which were later developed by Cattell into a set of core personality traits such as honesty, intelligence, charisma that could be linked to leadership. That's quite abstract again, isn't it? You just sort of generally speaking, this is what trait theory does. This is what some of the leading authors in the field have said. So now, as the examiner, if you just went straight away to your data to going, here are all the traits that make leaders great in my study, there would be something missing in the middle. And what's missing is this mediating language. Now, I am not a human and resources management person. So those of you listening who are might be cringing. I apologize for that, but this is what I've tried to do. In this study, which is looking at the extent to which men and women leaders are seen differently by their organizations on the basis of the personality and leadership traits they possess or display, I will be exploring through interviews and surveys how employees and peers of selected leaders describe their bosses. Therefore, I will be using trait theory and personality traits especially to distill a sense of which traits are ascribed to good leadership and the extent to which these may be regarded as gendered, with some traits being associated with masculinity and others with femininity. For example, are men considered assertive while women are meek or by contrast bossy? So I'm giving you a general example. I don't know what traits are going to come out yet. I haven't done my field work. Okay, but I'm thinking that probably this is what I'm going to try and use trait theory to help me do. And I'm hoping that this is where I'm going to be able to go with my analysis. So is everybody kind of following me so far around mediating language? Yep. Okay. I have noted that there are a couple of questions that came out earlier, and I have made a note of those. So let's carry on a little bit, and then we'll pause and have some questions. So now you might be sitting there thinking, but I don't have theory. What do I do? You know, I don't have theory like this. I don't have Bourdieu. I don't have trait theory. You may be working in a field that doesn't obviously have a theory that's named, like legitimation code theory or structuration theory or Bourdieu's field theory or something like that. But I'm going to argue that you do have something that counts as theory, okay? Even if what you are doing is working in a very practitioner-based field. Okay, decolonial theorists would argue that we have to be very careful about having this theory versus practice kind of divide in our thinking. and that sometimes our practice can lead to a theorizing of the way the world works, right? So we might call that inductive analysis. Now, these categories are not hard and fast, and you're going to read stuff in methodology textbooks that's going to have slightly different definitions of this. So I'm giving you more or less my understanding of what these things are. And if you have a different understanding, I'm really happy for you to please share that in the chat so we can all learn. But inductive analysis, essentially, as I understand it, moves from data towards theory. So often in inductive analysis, and I've seen this in papers and studies where people don't kind of declare a theoretical framework, but they do have particular kinds of more abstracted understandings of what it is that they're looking at. So they have an abstracted understanding of what the world is like, and they may be calling it particular kinds of concepts that they're linking together into a loose sort of conceptual framework. They may not necessarily have something they call a theoretical framework. This I've seen this quite a lot in education. But what they do is they look at the data and they say, but now all of these explanations of assessment practice or of how students behave are actually like their particular overarching categories or themes that are emerging from this data. And what do these point to? What kind of explanation can I offer of this aspect of education or of how the world works based on the kinds of things that are emerging from my data? So this is broadly speaking called grounded theory. Now, this may sound easy. Oh, excellent. I don't have to have a theoretical framework. I can just make up a theory. But developing theory is actually incredibly difficult to do very, very well. And this takes a lot of time. So generally speaking, if you're an honors or master's or PhD student, you may find it much less alarming and terrifying unless you have a very good supervisor who is a grounded theorist who knows exactly what they're doing and how to do it. I would caution you against doing grounded theory. And what we then do is we use a slightly more deductive form of analysis where we look at our theory and we say, the mediating language that I have created using my theory sort of kind of indicates to me that I'm probably going to do this kind of analysis, that I'm probably going to need to look broadly speaking for these kinds of things. So let me go to my data and let me see what's there. So your theory in that case informs the way in which you approach your data and the way in which you do your analysis. And it helps you begin the coding process so that you're not just randomly coding your data. You have your theoretical spectacles on. You may have them on gently, but you have them on. Okay. So when I say theory, I don't necessarily mean like something that has the name theory in it, like structuration theory, field theory, practice theory. But you do have a general understanding of what the world is like. You do have some kind of understanding of what the phenomenon is that you're looking at that does sit above the very specific context and very specific problem you are focused on, right? You have something that counts as a generalized understanding in your study and something that counts as a very specific understanding in your study. And analysis is the process of mediating between those two. Okay, so let's pause and take a couple questions. Robin, I'm going to go back to yours before I forget it. Robin asked, do you always have to transcribe your data? I don't know. It depends, I think, probably on the kind of analysis that you're doing. For example, if you were doing a narrative methodology and a narrative analysis, you wouldn't actually transcribe your interview necessarily. What you might actually do is read it 3, 4, 5, 6 times over. And then what you do is you use particular extracts from that data to create a narrative, literally like a story about the person that you're analyzing or the thing that you're interested in. So there are different kinds of modes of analysis, some which absolutely require word for word verbatim transcription of your interview or your focus group, and others which don't require that, which require maybe listening to the focus group conversation 3 or 4 times and then making key notes about particular excerpts of the data that you think are going to be useful. But in that case, what you'd be doing very much more than inductive work is deductive work, because what are you listening for? How do you know that's what you need to make notes about? So often when you're doing that kind of work, I mean, if you're doing some kind of inductive analysis where you have to do emergent coding, then I would argue that you probably need to transcribe, because you need to have all of the data there so that you don't miss anything. But if you have a very firm theoretical framework and you have a particular set of phenomena that you're looking for in the data, then you may not need to transcribe everything. You may be able to turn your raw data into findings in a different way. Okay, so Rieta says, what kinds of disciplines don't seem to make use of any theory? That's a difficult question, because now I feel like I'm going to be slagging off other people's disciplines, and I don't want to do any of that. I will say, in my experience, having worked with a lot of students from across the discipline, lots of scientists don't think that they have theory, but they do. They have abstracted understandings of the way the world works, and they may not think of it as theory in the way that somebody in education or sociology or anthropology would think about theory. English literature, they don't necessarily have particular theories that I've seen, but they do draw on different aspects of theoretical frameworks, for example, feminist theory, classics, some of the sort of hardcore humanities disciplines, the pure humanities disciplines don't always have recognizable what people in the more applied disciplines might recognize as theory. But everybody has some kind of abstracted understanding of the world, even if they don't necessarily call it theory. So classics, for example, would be another example, where they don't necessarily always have particular theoretical frameworks, but they work with different kinds of conceptual understandings of the world. I hope that answers your question. And you can challenge me on this. If you are a classicist or a philosopher or somebody like that, and you're going, oh, no, actually, we do have theory. Please write that in the chat, because I'm more than willing to learn. Is it advisable to use both research questions and a hypothesis in qualitative research? I think that depends very much, Imkendu, on the kind of study that you're designing. So generally speaking, hypotheses tend to go with a more positivist type or post-positivist type of paradigm, where you sort of have a sense that knowledge is to some extent quite objective, and you can propose an answer to your research question, which is almost always what a hypothesis is in the stricter sense of the word. And then you can go and either prove your hypothesis with the data that you generate and analyze, or disprove it. But in qualitative research, if you came to the collecting qualitative data session, I talked a little bit more about how it's quite hard when you work in more interpretive or critical or constructive paradigms to have a sense of what the answer to your research question is going to be. And we generally tend to discourage students from having too many assumptions going into the research and into the analysis about what the answer to their question is, because then you're never going to be surprised by your data, and you're probably going to miss things in your data. So generally speaking, if you have research questions where you're really saying, I don't know what the answer is, but these are the questions I'm asking, and this is what I'm going to go and try and find out, then I wouldn't have a hypothesis, because I would want my data to tell me the answer. I wouldn't want to tell my data the answer, which sometimes a hypothesis can do. So it depends on what paradigm you're working within, and it depends on the point of the research that you're doing and the kind of contribution you want to make. But generally speaking, I would say, and if other more experienced qualitative group researchers in the group can jump in here, those two things don't always go together very happily. You have to work quite carefully to make those two things work together in qualitative research, but it depends on the paradigm. Taryn, what is the difference between a theoretical framework and an analytical framework? Do you need both? The difference, to my mind, is that in the analytical framework is more closely connected to your methodology. It's part of your methodology. So the theoretical framework says, theoretically speaking, this is how you can explain the kind of phenomena that I'm interested in. And this is how I'm going to try and use or apply that theory to this study, but I'm still working at quite a general level. And then an analytical framework says, this is how I'm going to very specifically and carefully use theoretical concepts to turn them into tools I can use in the analysis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about translation devices, and that might answer your question in a minute, but if I haven't, please come back to me and you can tell me then. Will you then have material literature to support the emergent coding or grounded theory? Yes. So as Ed Machoba, you can't do emergent coding or grounded theory without data. And so your data will be, I'm so sorry, I've gone too far. Your data will be, your interview transcripts or your focus groups, or a play that you're reading or novels that you're reading. It depends on what your data is. Your data may be documents, it may be transcripts, it may be a huge set of field notes from lots of observations of people doing performances, or it may be video recordings, whatever your data is. But you would sit, and this is the thing about emergent coding, well, any coding, I would argue, is you can't read your data once and then go, right, okay, I know what my story is. You've got to immerse yourself in that data and spend time really getting to know it. And I think that's even more the case with inductive analysis, because you're going to have to go through multiple iterations of refining those codes and themes before you actually reach some kind of theoretical understanding or theoretical claims that you can make. How does one take out the subjectivity? Ooh, I don't know, Roman. I don't know if you can. I think to some extent, this is also where translation devices help. And I'm going to talk about those. And I am also going to talk a little bit about coding software. So please just put a pin in that. I'm going to come back to that. Rita, oh good, Rita, you're arguing with me. Okay, so Rita's in literary studies, and she says it actually does make explicit use of theory nowadays, but there is sometimes the sense that a close reading of texts can be done without theory, but she says, I think this is just a different kind of theory. And what becomes murky with literacy studies is then how the theory is actually applied to the text to make the claims that the author is making, because there's often no explicit methodology. And I have found that to be true about some literary studies, Rita, so thanks for that comment. Okay, everybody all right for now? Can I move on? Because I think some of the questions might be answered with what's coming up, but if I haven't answered your question, pop it in the chats. Just checking on the time. Okay, no, we're good. Right. So coding is the word, broadly speaking, that we use to apply to the we apply to the process of taking chunks of your data and saying this is about knowledge. This is about ways of knowing. This is about who you are as a person. This is about, so those categories, knowledge, knowing, who you are as a person, the curriculum, teaching practice, ways of doing assessment, feedback on assessment. I'm giving you some of the codes from my study now because that's the only one I can really think of right now in this moment. So what I did, and I did a qualitative study where I had observations of teaching and extensive field notes. I also had some video recordings of the lectures, and I had transcripts of those video recordings, although I did not transcribe the entire 1 hour lecture times 5 lectures. I transcribed excerpts, and I did that after I had read my field notes several times and done an initial analysis of the field notes so that I knew more or less what I was trying to get the video data to add, right? So I was doing a version, I think, of a form of triangulation there. I also had interview transcripts. I interviewed the lecturers, and I had all of the slides from their lectures and their course outlines. So I had all of that data. I did use in vivo as well. And what I did was the first point here, a soft eyes look. So I had my theoretical lens on, because once you work with some kind of theoretical understanding of the world, you actually never take your glasses off, right? You are collecting data with a theory in your mind, you're analyzing data with the theory in your mind, you're writing with the theory in your mind. So you mustn't let go of that theory, especially if it's a very particular theoretical framework that actually says this is the kind of analysis you need to do. So for example, if you are using Margaret Archer's structural realism, she argues that the way we understand reality is through an interplay, an exchange, a conversation, if you like, between the kinds of structures that generate particular kinds of ways of being in the world, cultures, and then our own agency and how we engage with those. So you would not do a straightforward thematic content analysis of your data if you were using that theoretical framework, because that theoretical framework would say you have to read your data in a very particular way to be able to see and understand this interplay, and then present that or represent that in your analysis. So you would have to think, how do I make sense of this? So what you do, and this applies whether you have something that you're thinking, yes, this is my theory, or whether you're thinking, I don't know if I have a very clear theoretical lens, I think I'm going to be working the other way around. You have to read and read and read your data until you are very familiar with it. So this is often why your supervisor may argue that instead of using research funds to pay somebody to transcribe your data, you should do that. Because the process of transcription is often the first step in the process of analyzing your data. Because as you're sitting there, listening to the person say the same thing over and over again so that you can type it all down word for word, you're starting to get really familiar with your data. You're starting to kind of remember it, right? And you are immersing yourself in that data. And that's where you want to be in a qualitative data analysis process. You want to know your data inside out, right? And it helps to have a relatively strong handle on the theory and also on the literature related to the topic so that you can start thinking, hey, I think I might have a finding here that challenges some of that literature that I wrote about in my literature review. And I'm going to pause here to say, please come next week because Kirsten Wilmot's going to be talking about writing the literature review and it's going to be great. Right. I'm going to come back here to say, so remember, when we make our contribution to knowledge, we're not just going to end our thesis saying, and that's my story, the end. The conclusion to your thesis is going to say, and this is the exact contribution I've made to knowledge, and this is how it relates to the studies that are already in the field that I had told you about in the first or second chapter of my thesis where the literature review is. So if you imagine it like a circle, you open the circle with this, these are my research questions, and then you go out into the field and you generate data, you analyze that data, you reach conclusions, and that helps you to close the circle. Here are the answers to my research questions, right? So you can't kind of leave it off as kind of going, and here's my study, because the reader's going to then think, so what? What does this all mean, right? So you're thinking, what does this all mean? That's your big question with analysis. My advice, make very good notes as you work. I used a combination of a research journal where I wrote to myself often, and I also had voice notes that I kept. I literally spoke my thoughts on my analysis out loud to myself. I very seldom come back and listen to those voice notes. Just the act of speaking it out loud and recording it helps me to hear what I'm thinking in a very different way to what I hear when I'm writing about it. I also had very lovely critical friends who were doing their PhDs and were at different stages, and we would meet periodically and we would talk about our findings with one another, and they would ask questions. Now, Robin, that might be one way of removing some of the subjectivity, is to have a critical friend who is somewhat knowledgeable about your study and is interested. Maybe you could do this for each other, where you come and you say, this is what the data is, this is what I think I'm finding, these are the themes, and your critical friend can say, really, like on what basis are you making that claim, or where's your evidence, or I don't know about that, that seems a bit partial, and they can help you actually work through some of those issues. So if you're worried about being overly subjective, and sometimes this is a worry, especially when we're doing research in the contexts in which we work or live, and we already have knowledge of those people in that context, it helps to keep a research journal and write to yourself, externalize your thoughts, put them down on a piece of paper so that other people could look at them or think about them or read them with you, and maybe have a critical friend or a couple of critical friends where you can share your work in progress and be open to having that challenged or questioned, because that often helps us to step back a bit and think about what we're using to make our claims. Am I using my own personal knowledge here, or am I actually using something that looks or counts as theory in this study? So I hope that answers your question. You can let me know if not. So iterative process means backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. Whether you're working inductively from data towards theorizing, or you're working more deductively, going from theorizing towards seeing how your data plays out that theory in a particular context. Basil Bernstein argues that there is a dialogue, a dialectical conversation, backwards and forwards between theory and data, whatever counts as data in your study and whatever counts as theory. The theory can help to shape your understanding and the meaning you make of the data, but at the same time, the kinds of data that you find and the kinds of findings you generate can also challenge and sometimes extend the theoretical explanations of the world, right? So that's what we mean by iterative. It's not a straight process. People have described this as cookie cuttering. So if you imagine if you've ever baked cookies, right? You roll out the cookie dough and then you go, here are the shapes, cut, 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 cut. Good, those are my cookies, I'm done. It's not a straightforward process like that, because what we want to do, I was really struck by this. If you've used NVivo and you've watched any of the lovely Australian woman who does all of the tutorial videos, one of the things she said really struck me when I was learning how to use NVivo. She said in qualitative research, what we really want is we want to be prepared to be surprised by our data. We want our data to tell us something we didn't know, right? Because that's why we're doing research, because we don't know. We think from the research that we've done, the reading that we've done, the theory that we have, the field work that we've done, we think we might know where we're going with the answers to our research. We don't want to go into your field work completely blind, because you might not get the right data. It would be a disaster. So you go in thinking, yeah, I think I'm going to need to look, for the answers in these focus groups, in these observations, in these field journals, in these performances, in these particular texts, right? All those different kinds of data that you wrote about in the chat earlier. I think that's where I'm going to need to go and look. And I think more or less as I read this data or generate this data or collect this data, that this is what I'm looking for. You need to know this if you're doing interviews or focus groups, or if you're doing observations and fieldwork, because how do you know what to write about in your fieldwork journal? How do you know what questions you need to ask? If you're asking people to keep journals for you, what are you asking them to keep a journal about? You're not just saying write down whatever you think. You're asking them to write about particular kinds of things. So you do sort of kind of have a form of a hypothesis in your mind. You have a sense of what it is that you're trying to do, but you don't want to have such a strong sense that you go into the research thinking, I'm going to prove that the answer that I have in my head is right. Because what you might do is a version of the cookie cutter where the only data you see is the data that fits inside the cutter that you've created. And you don't see any of the other data that may be valid and rich and relevant to telling a fuller story about the problem that you're interested in. So yes, Tabang, to some extent, theory can validate your data. It's more actually, I would say, that theory helps you make meaning of your data, and that the reading that you've done and the literature that you've written about and where you've positioned your study in the field, that to some extent maybe more validates your data to some extent, because what you're saying is you found the right kinds of things. But to some extent, theory does the same thing. I certainly had that experience when I was doing my fieldwork, that I could kind of hear my theory in what the lecturers were saying to their students and in what they were saying to me. That soft eyes, I could kind of begin to hear that I was getting the right kinds of data. So if that's what you mean by validate, to some extent, yes, theory can do that. Chakapaya says, transcribing my data helped me to engage with the literatures and the theory. It really helped me to be able to see the new knowledge that emerged. Yes, thank you. It's like a validation of what I'm saying. Transcribing is quite an important step. So what you need is some patience here. Okay, this is not a process that you want to rush too much. If you have a very tight work plan, This is an aspect of your research that you need to make, especially at PhD level, where you have a larger data set than you would at master's or honors level. You need to make time to really immerse yourself in your data and think about your data and listen to your data. Listen to what it's telling you. Listen to how the different data sources are speaking to one another and building on one another. So what did you find out from the focus groups with the students that engages what you found out with the interviews with the lecturers? What did you find out from the performances that you watched that adds something to the text that you read, that adds something, you know, so that your data is not, if you've got more than one source of data, don't treat them as separate. They have to be connected, and you will have explained in your methodology chapter why you are collecting more than one kind of data and how those different sets of data are going to connect with one another, and then take that through into the analysis. How are they speaking to one another? How are they helping you to see what it is that you can say about the world? So you can use this process to develop what Carl Mayton also calls translation devices. So when you're thinking about this analysis, you are making selections of what to focus on. Okay, and this speaks a little bit to the translation device, which is where I'm going next. So why, for example, did I kind of almost ignore all of the data that looked at how I designed my curriculum? Or why did I push that into the background? And why was I really focused on where they were talking about what they teach and why they teach? Because my research question was actually about teaching. It wasn't about curriculum. And the focus of my study, the unit of analysis, was the actual act of pedagogy in the classroom, not the curriculum and not the students. So that's also why I didn't interview students in my study. It's not that their voices don't matter, they do matter. It's just that I had to draw a boundary around my study. And what I really wanted to understand was the lecturer's point of view. That's why I talked to them. So when you look at your data, even in an honest study, you are very seldom, if ever, going to use every single piece of data you generate. You're going to have to leave stuff out. So how do you choose which data to really analyze and discuss in your thesis, and how do you choose which to leave out? Obviously, your research questions, your research aims and objectives are going to help you very, very much here, because that's what you're trying to answer. So you need to make sure that your findings and analysis talk about the data that's going to help you answer your research questions in the conclusion. But your theoretical tools, your analytical language that you're creating, that's also going to help you. So if you, for example, have theory that really that you've chosen because it focuses on what we know and how we know, knowledge and knowers, then that's also going to help you figure out what to look at and look for in your data, right? So that's more or less what I'm arguing here. So this is how we then move a little bit closer to what Mayton calls a translation device. And more or less, this is his structure. You have theory, which is quite an abstracted explanation of the world, whatever counts as theory. I'm putting theory in scare quotes here. You have your mediating language, like I showed you, which then brings that down a little bit to say, okay, so generally speaking in this study, this is what I think the theory means and what it might look like. But then the translation device is often developed in the process of working with and analyzing your data. You can't know what this is before you know what your data is. And that's when you then go, you know, I thought I was going to be able to talk about this, but there's nothing in the data. So I'm going to have to adapt my understanding of how I'm using my theory. So for example, in my mediating language and in my theoretical framework, I had the whole of Bourdieu's field theory. I had capitus, I had capital, I had habitus, I had field. I wrote this whole section on Bourdieu. And then I went and asked all my questions, and I kept it quite open, and nobody talked about habitus. I couldn't find any evidence of it in my data. So I couldn't have it in my analytical framework, and I couldn't even have it in my theoretical framework. I had to go back and take most of that out, because if your reader sees that there, they're going to look for it in your methodology. They're going to look for it in your mediating language, or however it is that you describe the way you're going to use your theory to do the analysis. And they're going to look for it in your findings. And if it's not there, they're going to be really confused as to why you have this whole section on habitus or whatever it is in your theoretical framework, and then you say nothing about it for the rest of the thesis. So the writing of the thesis is also an iterative process, right? You might write a whole section in your literature review, that at the end of the process of doing research, when you go back and pull your whole thesis together, you go, I don't need that anymore. Those 4 pages are completely redundant. They don't actually belong in this thesis, and then you've got to delete them. So bear that in mind as you move through your process, right? Translation devices are not a requirement. You don't have to have one. They don't necessarily work for every discipline and every thesis. But if you are able to develop something like this, it can enhance both the reliability and the credibility. Because if I read your study and you have told me exactly how you got your data and what you did with your data to generate the findings that you have, I might be able to do a version of replicating that study. Not exactly, obviously, but I might then say, okay, well, you did that study in Gauteng, but the conditions in the Eastern Cape are different than Gauteng. So maybe what would we learn that would be new if we did exactly that kind of study, but with a different population or in a different context or a different location? But if you don't tell me how you did that study, I can't replicate it. And then it's very difficult for me to build on your findings with findings of my own and therefore build knowledge cumulatively in my field. Also, of course, the more clear you are about the basis on which you're making claims to knowledge, the more credible your findings, the more believable your findings are, and the more likely your examiner is to be persuaded by your study, by the findings and the conclusions of your study. Okay, so we've got an example, right? We've got Bourdieu from earlier. This is his very theoretical description. I'm not going to read it to you again because you read it earlier. This is the same mediating language. They said in a study like this is broadly speaking what I mean by capitals, what I mean by the field, what I might mean by values or who values things. But that's still very general, right? So what I've done now is I've gone and analyzed my data and worked with it. And what I'm able to now actually say is, in this study specifically, the field was higher education, and the subfield I analyzed was public universities, represented here by Rhodes University. So this is where I did my study, right? The social symbolic capitals are exchanged and valued in this subfield, in this university, specifically in the applications and admissions process within the Faculty of Arts. So I'm being very, very specific now, have emerged from the first stage of data coding and organization, and I've refined them into this set of categories. Linguistic capacity, by this I mean home language and additional languages that are spoken. In this study, it's mainly English, isiXhosa, and isiZulu. It's not all the languages. It's just, mainly these 3. Maybe there are others. Of course, there are others. We're a very diverse country. Okay. 2, prior education. So you'll see here, it's just the schools one has attended and the marks obtained. I'm now making it even more specific. Public or private school, the name of the school and the area that the school is in. Okay, because names of schools also carry particular kinds of symbolic power, right? So if you say, I went to I went to St. Andrews. It's a very different thing than if you say, like, I went to Standard High School down the road, right? So what the study is looking at is, what do people value when people apply to university, when students apply to university? Are they consciously looking at the names of private schools and going, oh, well, this must be a great student, let's let them in. And then they're looking at the names of school from rural areas or from poorer areas and they're going, oof, I don't know about that, right? Because that's discriminatory. And so maybe what this study is trying to find out is, to what extent do we subconsciously or consciously discriminate against students in admissions processes, and what does that mean for equality and access and success in higher education? So, right, you're always thinking, what am I doing this study for? What am I doing this study for? What am I trying to find out? Why am I trying to find it out? That must be operating in the back of your mind all the time, like minimized. That tab must be minimized, but it must always be open. Okay. NSC results, the number and the kind of subjects that were taken and the marks. So sometimes, for example, if students do extra subjects, that may be more valued than students who only do the minimum amount of subjects. Students who do advanced program might be valued differently than students who don't. Extracurricular activities, so did they do sport at school? Did they volunteer? Did they do paid or unpaid work that they can reflect in their motivation? The motivation, so the letter that they write, the reasons they give for wanting to study, and written ability, and then their identity. So who do students say they are? What does the faculty say it is? What identity does the faculty have? And then what identity does the university have? So this will be further refined as I move through the process of further coding and analyzing and making sense of my data. But I've already begun to say, I am looking at these categories. So if you came along and wanted to do this study, but you wanted to do it with the University of Venda, or you wanted to do it with Walter Sisulu University, you could say, I'm going to look at the same categories and see what I can find. And then maybe your study and my study can have a conversation about the same kinds of issues that you're interested in: access, success, advantage, disadvantage. You following me on that? Can you kind of see what it is that I'm talking about when I talk about a translation device? I'm hoping that it'll become also clearer the more you work with your own data, because this, as I've said, is a process that is iterative, and it's often very difficult to imagine it if you're not working with your data at the moment. Okay, it's very quiet in the chat, so I'm hoping I haven't stunned you all into disbelieving silence. All right, so I'm going to move on a bit, and then we're going to pause for questions at the end. Thomas says, I've seen a translation device called Operationalizing the Theory. Yeah, Thomas, I would agree. It is a way of operationalizing the theory, which essentially means putting the theory to work in making meaning of the data, the specific data that you're working with. And you can do it in a very, very particular way. I've had students, for example, who've literally created tables saying, like, this is the data code, this is a general description of that, and this is examples, specific examples from my data that refer to that code, literally putting it into a table. And I've had other studies I've read where they do it far more narratively. I think the important principle here is, are you explaining as clearly as you can to your readers / examiners how you got from raw data to findings and claims to knowledge on the basis of the data that you've generated, collected, or created? Or are you saying, this is how I got my data, blank in the middle, and then going, these are the claims to knowledge that I'm making? Because if there's blank in the middle, you may struggle to convince your reader of the credibility of your argument, or you may find that your report comes back with questions around, can you make it clearer? On what basis you found this? On what basis did you generate these findings? Because I'll find findings is maybe also the wrong word, because it almost sounds like you sort of looked at your data and you found stuff and then you presented it. And findings are actually created out of raw data. So the raw data is like all your transcripts, all your documents, all your observations, all of that stuff. And it's big. And through a process of saying, what do I need to look at? What is important here and what is not important? What does this mean? How do I know what it means? How do I work out what it means? What does it mean in relation to what? In relation to my research question, in relation to my theory, in relation to the literature. There's this whole conversation that happens between you and the data, between the data and the theory, and between you and the literature and your data and the literature. And that's why it's complicated, because in order to turn this into an argument that makes a contribution to knowledge, you have to go through a multi-stage process of figuring out how this all fits together. So I think it's important to remember that analysis is part of your argument. It's not this technical process. It's a creative process. It's a process in qualitative analysis that us as researchers are very much part of. So it's almost impossible to be objective. But you can, if you find yourself making too many judgments that you feel are too personal, there are ways, as I've said, that you can try and step back from your data and look at it a little bit less partially. And theory and translation devices help with that. Because if you've said, these are the categories I'm looking for, and this is what that means in this data set, then you can't necessarily start imposing your own partial beliefs about what things are, because the translation device sort of says, no, but hang on, you've said that it's this. That doesn't mean translation devices can't be adapted and refined as the process goes on, but it does help you create a slightly more impartial language with which to then operationalize your theory and talk about your data. So we connect the specific with the general, as I've said, and the explanations can come from theory. They can also come from literature. They can also be generated by you in a form of grounded theory analysis, if you and your supervisors decide to go that route, right? So what I found really useful in doing my own analysis, because you can get buried in data, you can get quite lost in the whole process, and you can start describing your data and reporting and forget that you're actually selecting data to make meaning, to make sense of it, and then to use that to tell a story that answers your research questions. So it's quite useful to help yourself step back every now and then, and these questions might help. So what does this piece of data mean if I consider my theoretical or conceptual understanding of this phenomenon? How do the theory or concepts that I'm using in this study help me explain what's going on in this data? Does this connect with key findings in the studies that I've included in my literature review? Does it challenge these? Does it extend them? Is this something completely new? How? Why? So some of these questions, and you can of course generate your own kinds of questions as well. These are quite useful to write about and think about. Rita says, when you code your data, how many codes are too many? Okay, so when I did my first coding, I did a version of emergent coding, but it wasn't emergent in the sense that I was just letting the data tell me whatever it wanted to tell me. I did have my theory spectacles on. I knew that I was looking at teaching, maybe a little bit at curriculum, maybe a little bit at assessment. I didn't want to leave out anything. I wanted my data to kind of just tell me what it was saying. So I created lots of what I called quite descriptive codes. I literally had like curriculum design, assessment, feedback, and I had probably about 60, which is way too many. But what I then did in the second round of coding was I then went, well, if you look at curriculum design, and curriculum structure, essentially speaking, these are the same thing, and I've got the same kinds of data. So what I did was I then said, in this code, what's the sort of concept that I'm talking about here? So let me move one step up from description towards analysis and go, conceptually speaking, I'm talking about, and I sort of gave it a bigger heading like the process of curriculum design. And then I moved all of the data into that code. So then I refined it to probably about 20 codes. And then I was like, okay, but now I really need to talk with my theoretical lens. So I went, okay, so which of this is about how you become a knower? Which of this data is about the nature of knowledge? Which of this data is about the structure of the field? And then I had 6 codes. And then I worked out how to actually tell the story of the data through a number of drafts of the chapter with my supervisor. So that's what also, again, what I mean by an iterative process. So I tried very hard not to try and rush to the theory out of the gate. I tried to sort of move to it descriptively. And I also found that was a lot less scary than trying to like, yeah. So, sorry, I'm just typing a comment quickly. So always keep your research questions in mind, and be clear about the fact that you're not just presenting all the data, you're choosing data, you're making sense of the data using whatever counts as your theoretical or analytical conceptual tools. And you are then going to use that data to tell a story in your analysis that is going to answer your questions. Okay, so the moral of the story is, don't tell me what your data says, because this is one thing I see quite a lot of. I see a student sort of saying, this is the theme, this is what, and with a slightly more generalized description of what the theme is and what it means. And then they have 2 or 3 quotes from the data. And then they say, so in this data, what she's saying is, and you're just kind of repeating what she's already said in her own words, this participant that you're citing. And I sort of read this and I think, but I can see that from the data quote that you've shown me. So what I want to know is, in light of the problem that you're addressing in this thesis, what do you think what she said means? Or does it challenge received understandings of the phenomenon? Is it confirming what you already know? So you have to move a step beyond that to show me what your data means in the context of the study that you're doing and in response to the research questions and objectives that you have in mind. All right. So that's the process of theorizing or generalizing, so that you're not just redescribing all your data. You're making claims. You're providing evidence from the data that shows me that that claim is a valid claim to make. And then you're saying, here's what I want you to make of this claim. Here's what I want you to understand of this claim. Here's what I think this means, not here's what it is, again, in my own words or in other words. Okay, so I think that's quite an important step, and that is a tricky step to make. And you may well find that your first, second, third draft is really just trying to figure out a basic organization and story and just kind of getting the data down on the page. And my supervisor said to me, don't worry about how many data quotes you include. If you feel like you need to put 10 in, just put 10 in. I'll tell you if it's too many. And she was able to then read my draft and say, okay, we don't need 10 quotes here, just 2 or 3, pick the best 2 or 3, and that'll be enough. And, you know, when you are using data quotes, it's also quite important that you don't let them speak too much for themselves, but you integrate them into your text so that they're part of the meanings that you are making. And you're not just putting your data there and almost to some extent saying to your readers, I don't know, what do you think? Okay, you need to tell me what you think. Because if I'm examining your thesis and I'm awarding a degree, or I'm helping the university that you're going to award you a degree, I need to know that you know what all of this means and that you know what the answers to your research questions are. Okay, so iterative process, be patient with yourselves. Don't assume that you're going to get it all done on the first go or the second go or the first draft or the second draft. It's probably going to take a few drafts, especially at PhD level, to tell the story the way that you really wanted to and the way that you need to in order to do your study justice. We're running out of time, so I'm going to leave this out as a little exercise. There are different kinds of analytical frameworks. You can do thematic analysis. There's lots of different kinds of thematic analysis. The Braun and Clark reading is a very, very good one. You can go and look for it on Google Scholar. It will come up. It's a seminal reading. There's legitimation code theory, there's analytical dualism, there's critical discourse analysis, there's Bourdieu's field theory, there's different theories. For example, Stephen Luke's theory of power, there's decolonial theories, there's Southern theory, there's feminist theory and theories of affect, and all of these can be adapted and turned into particular kinds of analytical frameworks. And by analytical framework, what we really mean is some form of that mediating language and translation device that is useful for and relevant for the kind of study you're doing, and that helps you explain to your reader how you got from research design to collecting data to organizing and selecting data to making sense of that data and telling a story with it. That's really where you need to be going. Emily says, when you're analyzing documents, do you follow the same approach for coding and constructing themes as you would for interview data? Potentially, Emily. I think it depends on what you're looking for in the data. So I used NVivo, which I think is this slide here, right? So I used NVivo. Now, some of you said, when I said, how are you analyzing your data? You said, I'm using NVivo. Now, NVivo, Atlas TI, they also, for example, QDA Minor Lite and Tigera are open source free online versions of Atlas TI and NVivo that you can go and check out. We may be running another course in the second semester on using NVivo, so do look out for that. We haven't quite finalized our program yet, but bear that in mind. There are also lots and lots and lots of tutorials for Atlas TI and NVivo online. Anyway, these are just programs. They're tools They cannot actually analyze your data for you. You have to do that. They can't tell you what your data means. They can just help you organize it into different nodes or like little folders. And they can help you, if you use them in a more advanced way, they can help you see potentially where you've repeated yourself, where you've got the same kinds of words emerging. So if you're doing something like a discourse analysis, you can literally search through all of your data for the word power. And you can look at all the different where it appears, who says it, how they talk about it. And then you can create a theme on power and you can put all that data there and you can write about that if that's the theme that's relevant to your study. So what I did was I imported all of my interview transcripts as Word documents. I imported all of the field notes. I transcribed all my field notes and I put them in as Word documents. I put my video transcripts in as Word documents. And I also had the course outlines and the study guides as Word documents. And I put them all into NVivo as my data sources. And then I started looking through them. And as I found the words like curriculum or curriculum design or whatever, I kind of put them into the curriculum folder. And then as I found words on assessment, I put them into the assessment folder. So essentially, I wasn't coding each document separately. I was coding all the documents, but I was looking for particular words. I was looking for particular themes. I was looking for particular concepts or ideas. So, you know, you can do the same thing without NVivo and Atlas TI. You can do it with highlighters. You can do it with folders on your desktop. You have to be a bit creative about it, but you don't have to use data management software. I certainly found it quite helpful because I had a lot of data and I had lots of different sources of data, but it's not a requirement. And certainly, like any technology, it's just a tool, guys. It doesn't have a brain. You're the brain. So if you use the data analysis software badly and it doesn't help you analyze your data, it's going to actually stand in your way. So you have to, this is the thing, right? It takes time to learn how to use these tools well. But the plus is you can use it in quite a basic way, or you can use it in a more complex way, depending on how much time you have and how savvy you are. I used NVivo in quite a basic way. I didn't need it for more than that. So I didn't bother to learn all of those other things that you could do with it, like network analysis and stuff, because I didn't need that. So just do bear that in mind, that if you are using NVivo, it isn't going to do the analysis for you. It's just going to help you organize and see your data more clearly. But you're still going to have to use that data to tell the story that's going to make your contribution to knowledge. Okay, so what I've given you are some sort of, oh, thank you, Thomas. Okay, open source software, is that? Yes, I found this. NVivo is awesome, but when your license runs out, you no longer have access to your data. In order to get access to your project data, you have to renew the license. And you can get licenses through Rhodes if you are a registered student at Rhodes and your supervisor writes a motivation, and if they have licenses available to you, and they have a limited number, so they may not, and it's very expensive if you have to buy it, and it's a one-year license. So I have, for example, had students get the license a year before they needed it, and they put all their data into it, and then there's no more license available to them when they come to analyzing, and now their data, they're locked out of their data. Atlas TI is the same. So it's really, really, really useful to think about investigating QDI Minor Light or Tigera or one of the other open access software options, because then you will never get locked out of your data and you will have access to it even after. Because you must remember, for those of you maybe doing honors, but definitely doing masters and PhD, you may want to publish. You will probably want to publish parts of the study. You may want to come back to your data in a year's time or 2 years' time as a postdoc, or if you're moving from master's into PhD and you're doing the same kind of study and extending it, and you want to look at your data again and reanalyze it, and then you can't because you're locked out of your data because the NVivo license is finished. So do bear that in mind. Thank you, Tom. It's a very good point. Okay, so this is like my final slide, and then we have a few more minutes for the last couple of questions. To undertake meaningful analysis, you have to really engage with your data, as I've been saying. You have to move beyond telling us what's in the data. This person said this, then this person said that, then this document also said this, and this, you know, reconfirmed what I also found in this other source. Okay, cool, but so what? Keep asking yourself that question, guys. So what? So what? So what? So what? And answer that question, because you have to actually tell us at the end, what is the significance of what you found? Why should we care? What does this add to the field that we didn't already know? What does it help us learn that we hadn't already learned enough of, right? So you've got to be convincing and credible. You can't just say, well, I saw it in the data. Okay, so did other people find similar kinds of things? Is there a theoretical explanation or theorized explanation of what you're finding? You can't just kind of do a take my word for it sort of analysis. You need to have claims to knowledge. You need to have credible evidence from your data. And then you need to explain what that means so that you can answer the so what question. And you need to build your argument. So this is why we also say it's iterative. You build your argument a draft at a time. You build your argument as you move through the data. The more you become immersed in it, the more you'll see things. At some point, you're going to have to stop because you're going to have to actually finish the thesis and not turn it into your life's work. But you are going to have to, you know, it's complex, it's messy, it's iterative, it's not a straightforward process. And it's also something that I would really strongly recommend you do not undertake all by yourself. Talk to your supervisor, get yourself a critical friend, talk to your research journal, talk to your phone, find you know, other people that you can talk to, even if it's somebody who's not academic at all. You know, I had a friend who would go on long walks with her daughter who was in high school when she was doing her thesis, and her daughter would say, tell me about your work, Mom. And she'd talk to her daughter, and her daughter couldn't say, well, I don't know if that analysis is correct, Mum, but she could hear herself saying it out loud. And the more her daughter got to know her study, the more she was able to say, oh, but didn't you say something about that yesterday? Or so, you know, there are lots of places we can find critical friends and people to help us. But it's really important, if you want to do a credible analysis, a convincing analysis, that you don't try and do this all in your own head. Lemmy says, when you say you used in vivo in a basic way, you used in vivo in another conventional method. No, I only used Lemmy in vivo, but in vivo, Lemmy. But what I mean is, I just used it to help me create basic organizational codes and then turn those into more conceptual codes. In vivo can actually help you do node analyses. It can help you look for frequency of particular kinds of terms. It can help you create networks of different kinds of things. It can help you see your data in a whole range of different ways. I really just used it to code my data, to organize my data, and then to look for particular words and how often they reappeared and in different parts of the data, so that I could begin to actually put all of the things that were about knowledge into one section, so that I wasn't talking a bit about knowledge here and then 3 pages later I was writing about it again, and then 5 pages later I was writing about it again and confusing my reader. So I really just it helped me organize my thinking. And so that's what I mean by I used it quite basically. In vivo, Atlas TI, these can all do very, very, very cool stuff with your data, but it depends on how much you need in order to do your analysis. Are there any more questions or comments before we close? We are pretty much at 4:30. I'm going to give you a minute or two to type if you do have questions. If you do need to go, obviously, of course you can. And thank you very much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your week. This is going to be available later on YouTube, so if you have missed anything, you can always come back, go through it again. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. I'm glad it was useful. This is a nerve-wracking one because it's so much and it's an hour and a half, and I hope I haven't just like completely overwhelmed your brains. I'm sorry if I have. Okay, all right. Well, you guys have my email address. So again, I'm going to send this out to the whole list, but those of you who are here and who are keen for obviously more semester 2 seminars, please think about things that you think we can help you with and send us some ideas. Like I said, we might not be able to accommodate all of them, but we can certainly try and accommodate as many as we can. So please let us know. And thank you all very much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your evening and your week and your weekend. And we'll see you hopefully next Thursday for Kirsten Wilmot's session on writing the literature review. Okay. Yes, well, I will send around the YouTube link on the CPGS tomorrow morning, and I'll send around the one for collecting qualitative data as well, so that you guys can watch them both together if you want to. Thank you all very much. Bye, everybody.